So one of the, as you've heard today, one of the huge challenges of the Internet of Things, securing the Internet of Things, is a whole new diversity of endpoints, right? Most of the discussions we've been having about security, cybersecurity in the last 20 years have been about securing servers, securing desktops, securing laptops, and maybe more recently mobile devices, mobile phones. The Internet of Things is going to see an explosion of endpoints of all different form factors, from wearable and embedded devices. We've already heard about wireless-enabled medical devices, insulin pumps, to industrial devices, cars, and telematic systems that are going to be internet connected and providing real-time data. We've already seen with GE's engines are online now and relaying data in real time back to GE's cloud for analysis on the engine performance. We know that. So this is going to be a revolution both in data and the amount of data that's going to be created by these devices, but also in how organizations can manage and secure that data, and also in the types of companies that are going to be having to wrestle with security problems or security issues around software development, application development, and deployment. And that's kind of the focus of this last panel, which is on securing hardware and industrial devices. We have an amazing panel put together, actually, even if I do say so myself. And it starts with our moderator, Robert Vamosi, who is a CISSP and a security analyst at the firm Mocana. And Mocana's been a supporter of Security Ledger, my blog, and Robert is also the author of When Gadgets Betray Us. So he's not only a great moderator, but he's somebody who's actually thought deeply about these issues of device security. I welcome Robert, and Robert, feel free to introduce your panel.
Paul, you took my introduction away. Okay, so as Paul said, I am a CISSP and senior security analyst at Mocana. I've been covering the security space for over 15 years. I was a writer at ZDNet, CNET, and Forbes. I continue to write for the DeviceLine blog at Mocana. Mocana is a company that has been in the space from day one. In 2004, they started releasing products known as the Device Security Framework, which are a series of tools that go into embedded devices. And they work with over 200 combinations of RTOSs and chipsets. They're in over 100 million devices deployed in the world today. In 2010, we started wrapping mobile apps. We started injecting code into those apps that reflect the company policies so that employees can go to the company's app store, download an app, and put a secure app onto their phone without having the IT department muck around. So we move away from this idea of managed devices and focus squarely on the data. Now, in February of this year at RSA, Mocana released its first hardware appliance, which is the Mocana Atlas. And what we're going to do there is we're terminating the endpoints for all of these VPN tunnels coming in from the apps that we have wrapped. And looking ahead to the future, we can use that to terminate the endpoints for the devices in the field, the Internet of Things devices that we have secured out in the field. So this is a purpose-built device that provides two-factor authentication and certificate enrollment that's very easy for the end user. And with regarding apps, once you've authenticated, you can then go to other federated apps fairly easy. You don't have to re-authenticate over and over. So it liberates the employee. And in fact, that's what the name Mocana means. It's Swahili for to liberate. But anyway, I'm here today to talk about the Internet of Things. And as Paul said, he has assembled an awesome panel. I'm delighted to be presenting the last panel of the day just because this is an exciting topic. I've been thinking about it for years. When I started my book in 2007, there wasn't a name for this. I called it hardware hacking. Joe Grand would get up on stage at Black Hat and talk about how he would deconstruct these things, and I'd be like, nobody is talking about this. So I'm happy to see that we've moved to the point where we're having open discussions. And now I'm going to let each panelists introduce themselves, and I'd ask them to do maybe 2 to 3 minutes of what they're doing in the IoT space, particularly with regards to hardware. Richard, I'm going to start with you.
My name is Richard Soley. I'm chairman and CEO of the Object Management Group. Some of you will have heard of us as a standards organization. It's been around for 25 years. We've started out in the middleware space, so connecting devices, connecting software systems is something that goes all the way back to our original DNA in 1989 when I was 6 years old.
I actually was 6 years old in 1989.
Good boy. I get to say that. We moved into the modeling space in the mid-90s, and so if you're familiar with UML, SysML, BPMN, those languages for modeling systems, software, complex systems, and so forth, those are all ours. But actually 85% of OMG standardization now is in vertical markets, and I think that's actually very relevant. We develop standards for financial systems, healthcare, manufacturing, transportation, life sciences, military communications, civil government, and so forth. And security has always been an issue in all of those. I think most relevant for today, since 2004, we have been managing groups of people that are not developing standards, but rather sharing experiences in the move to various technology or management techniques. The first of those was the Service-Oriented Architecture Consortium, or SOA Consortium, BPM Consortium. The Cloud Council is actually us, the Consortium for IT Software Quality. But most relevant, about 4 weeks ago, we brought together the CEOs of Intel, IBM, Cisco, AT&T, and General Electric to found something called the Industrial Internet Consortium. The Industrial Internet Consortium, or IIC, we deliberately gave it a name that's hard to say because iiconsortium.org was available, is a group of now about 50 companies joined in the last 4 weeks. That are not developing standards, but rather putting together use cases for Internet of Things technology in the industrial space. So almost all the conversation since I got here today, only about 2 hours ago, my apologies, there's another IoT event across town, which we won't talk about in detail because it will piss off Paul. But almost all of the talk that has been the last couple hours has really been on toasters talking to refrigerators, which is completely uninteresting to the IIC members. They're looking at industrial systems that have been essentially unaffected by the internet. When I was working on discrete programmable controllers in 1980, they used ladder diagrams to define how a brake lining plant at General Motors worked. Today, for nearly 40 years later, they still do, and they don't integrate through the internet technologies or any other technologies with the rest of the universe. That includes jet engines, it includes large financial trading systems, it includes power generation and power distribution systems, and all sorts of other interesting industrial systems. The IIC members are putting together those use cases, defining test beds. We've lined up about $100 million in test bed funding from governments and industrial sources to actually build test beds. And then, as the result of those test beds, generate not only products and services, not that I will sell, but that our members will sell, but also to understand what works and what doesn't work, what security solutions need to be invented to solve industrial system integration problems, and what standards in general need to be built. Priorities and standardization requirements are going out to standards organizations from IIC. I will tell you, and I won't name companies, but I will tell you that there have been companies that joined and said, yeah, we'll work on the architecture now. The protocols are not a real major issue, and security, we'll figure that out after we got the system up and running. Having been involved in IT for a long time and industrial systems for a long time, and I'm sure many of you are in the same situation, you know you can't add it later, no matter how hard you try, and if you think I'm wrong, just look at the internet. So that's my interest. We're not a hardware organization, but we are working very hard with hardware organizations to secure the way those systems, those devices, and those effectors are connected to each other in a controlled way.
Thank you. Mark?
Mark Robinson, I work for HID Global. For those of you who don't know who we are, if you've ever used a badge to open a door, if you flip that badge over, you'll likely see our logo on the back. So our core business is physical access control, so we're building hardware devices that are used to secure all that critical infrastructure. Where Internet of Things really intersects our world is in two ways. So people want to use the IDs that we issue in new ways. So whether it's secure printing, log on to your laptop, how do you build devices that can read our credentials? And then really building other devices to house our credentials. So as wearables come, as phones come, how do you use those things to open the doors? How do we deploy securely onto devices that we didn't create? Really the kinds of challenges that we're facing.
Colin?
Hello. Yeah. My name is Colin Malina. I'm a researcher at Northeastern University in Boston. I'm coming more from like the mobile phone like research area, but I did a lot of embedded systems research. But my interest lately is more into maybe updating services. So because you will always have, your devices will always have like security vulnerabilities. So you have to like find ways and making or providing updates. And one problem which I would say you would really clearly see like from the mobile phone area is that you have 3 or more parties involved in like when you build a device, so maybe you have the hardware platform manufacturer, then maybe you have like the device manufacturer itself, and then you have maybe the application vendor who like buys the device from the second party, builds their own application, and then sells it to their customers. So if you have like a vulnerability or like any like problem, maybe it's just like some configuration issue that is rooted like in the base platform, maybe the platform manufacturer fixes it, then it has to be propagated. And in the mobile phone space, this has to be like a huge issue, and I bet we will see that like in this Internet of Things area. And I think it could be even worse, because if you have a device where not every person has 1 or 2, but you have like, I know, millions of them scattered everywhere, and if you can't like remotely update them, then you have to like send out a lot of people, and this will be probably very expensive. That's like one area, like this updating across like multiple parties. And the second one, I think most of the like Internet of Things devices probably run on like very cheap hardware. And so we were investigating methods to like bring classical like computer software security hardening and defensive mechanisms to devices which are very resource constrained. And so adding security to those devices and platforms without like creating huge overhead. So it's more like patching and hardening small and embedded devices. That's like my research area.
Willow?
I'm Willow Brew. I'm a research affiliate with the Center for Civic Media out of the MIT Media Lab, and also with the Berkman Center for Internet and Society out of Harvard. I'm also with a group called Geeks Without Bounds, which deals with the overlap of technology and disaster and humanitarian response. And so it's a different sort of scale from industrial design, but we're starting to look at participatory mapping, so the devices that people are using to talk about the areas that they live in to hold their governments accountable, but also things like open water sensors, so that you can tell what's going on with water points if you don't have water infrastructure. Because these are often happening in countries where there's a lot of corruption, or what we would call corruption, any way to edit or mess up the data is going to be beneficial to some parties and not to others. But these are also incredibly low-cost devices that are going into places that people don't use a lot of technology if they have ever used it at all. And so the amount of overhead that goes into it when you're serving 70,000 refugees whose personally identifying information is vital to their livelihood is obviously of interest.
So one of the things that I like to say is just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. It looks as though the Internet of Things will keep evolving. We're going to continually add new things that maybe should not be connecting to the Internet. And in this case, we're talking about things that are hardware. And oftentimes they've got very limited resources, limited battery, limited capabilities. And they're out in the field. Sometimes they're very, very hard to reach if we're talking about like a smart grid, or they're in our bodies, or they're in some other inaccessible space. My question to the panelists here is, because we're talking about hardware, how do you update something that may be architectural in that hardware that's causing the flaw, as opposed to software?
I think the bottom line solution is you make that hardware as dumb and simple as possible. And that the simpler it is, the less likely you're going to have to make any changes and put intelligence elsewhere. I think there are obvious cases where you're going to have a lot of intelligence next to the sensor, because the sensor looks like a BlackBerry.
That's how old I really am. There's a whole bunch of sensors in here, and there's also a supercomputer in this space. And the battery lasts 2.5 days, by the way. And so in that particular case, you're going to do some computes here because you can. But in most cases, and it's fairly trivial because this is generally connected to do software updates, so that's not a big deal. But for most sensors, they better be dumb, because otherwise you're going to be updating them all the time, and you're going to be out in the field collecting them back off or digging them back out of your patients.
Mark?
For us, I think it's reducing the dependence on the hardware itself to supply the security. So the assumption is the hardware could get hacked, so we build our security models into the software and try to make those flexible so that when and if the device does get hacked, one, we can deploy new software to it, and two, that attack is contained within that. So avoiding things that are built into the hardware in terms of encryption. Performance-wise, we can do everything we need to do in software. So whenever we can, we do.
I'm not a really hardware person, so I would also try to go with very simple hardware and do as much in software in the back end as possible. If the hardware itself is compromised, you probably cannot do anything. Then you have to dig it out. But otherwise, remote. If it's just software compromise, then you can still try to have a really baseline and try to reset, reflash, update the system. But
often when we're deploying things into the field, the difficulties that we run into are far more social and political than they are the technology. And so just because we can deploy something at a certain level of complexity and precision does not mean that will be accepted and adopted.
Okay. I want to pick up on your point about having a simple device. Simple devices, would that include encryption? Would that include all the things that we would need for a security solution? How simple are we talking about?
Simpler than that. In fact, I completely agree with Mark that if you put it in the hardware, you're eventually going to have to update it. We find bugs in every encryption protocol and every encryption algorithm that's ever been invented, eventually. And if we don't, then NSA does. You might as well put as simple as possible a device out there, so that and then make sure that you can update just with software, either on the device or remotely, rather than have to dig them all up and replace them. So no, I think just do this unless you already have incredible intelligence at the device. So for example, a mobile phone, a cellular phone, where you already have a supercomputer there at your beck and call. Make the device as simple as possible, so that you don't have to dig it out. You don't have to find it in the field. You don't have to pull it up from the ocean floor, et cetera.
With many medical devices like cochlear implants, it is reliant upon the how hardcore the hardware is, because you can't pull it back out, and so you can't simplify things down there.
So that's true, but and the famous case, of course, is Dick Cheney's heart device, which was remotely programmable until they turned it off because the Secret Service didn't want somebody to walk by and turn off his heart. No, I'll stop there. What's Einstein's quote? As simple as possible, but no simpler. That's what you ought to be doing. So, I mean, the question was specifically about encryption algorithms. Probably a bad idea.
Really? Any follow-up on that? I guess where I'm going with this would be you would need to authenticate that update that's going to come. And would you have a device that's simple and yet be able to authenticate that the update is coming from the manufacturer, that it is what it is?
In both directions, right? You need the device to be able to know that the update's coming from the manufacturer, and you need the manufacturer to know that that is the device that they intend to be talking to. So, yeah, there's got to be some identity. As I say, as simple as possible, but no simpler.
Okay.
I think beyond the identity, it's really that root of trust, right? So how do you know you can trust this device, and how does that device know it can trust you? So one approach we've taken is relatively simple hardware, but say with a secure element in it. So that secure element is providing a higher level of trust than a typical microprocessor would, which is where all the algorithms run. then you have a single key in there that's your point of trust when you go to update it that can verify that firmware load. It can verify your identity when you do go to interact with it.
So we are going to have these
Use
devices.
something absolutely secure like OpenSSL.
No. No. So we are going to have these devices. They're going to be in places. Is it possible then that we shouldn't be using the internet as we know it today, but move towards what GE is calling the industrial internet, or a medical internet that is separate and distinct and segmented from the public internet that we have?
So Metcalfe's law says no, right? Metcalfe's law says the whole point is to use the internet technologies, whether or not it's the internet or an internet. That's where you get the value. Actually, I just came from, as I said, from another IoT conference, and somebody actually pointed out maybe this is the opportunity where we'll finally push real secure solutions to the Internet, not of things, because the Internet of Things needs real secure solutions. So no, I mean, we're going to have to figure out how to do it with the Internet.
But I would think in Willow's case that if you want to protect the data, just get it off of the public internet, you'd be creating yet another infrastructure that somebody would have to learn and figure out and deconstruct.
There's already very little connectivity in an awful lot of the places that I go, and so suggesting installing another one is mind-boggling.
Just another bank of modems.
Yes. Oh.
Yeah, I think my opinion would be that would be more of an obfuscation technique, and whether it's this internet or that internet, when you have all these new industrial devices there, they're going to start hacking each other on the new internet. So I think that fundamentally you have to solve the problem of trusting those devices or making risk-appropriate decisions. Does this device need to be connected? Does this need to be on the Internet of Things? Or is it so critical to what we're doing that we need to physically interact with it to do what it has to do?
There is an internet, which is not the internet, in which there are Faraday cages around the connecting cables and no Wi-Fi allowed. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It's called IntelliLink. And it has wikis, and it has Google search and so forth. And it also has, and the wikis are mostly things about terrorists, actually. But I mean, it's extraordinarily expensive to maintain, even though it uses internet technologies and off-the-shelf internet equipment, and spends an enormous amount every year making sure that nobody accidentally or on purpose connects it to the internet.
I want to pick up on some subjects that Willow and I talked a little bit about, and that is, I guess I'm going to morph it a bit and make it into a privacy question, and that is, we have more and more sensors out there collecting abstract data, and you're able to reconstruct that data, not maybe into the specific person, but into a model of that person. How are you and your groups working toward the privatization of that data so that it doesn't lend itself to that?
I'm a big fan of small data, of local data that is only viewable, or at least first viewable to the people upon which the data is taken. And so that they can self-organize, so that they can figure out what to do, so that they can figure out what is appropriate for them based on their cultural values. Because our ideas of privacy are very different than most of the rest of the world. And if you set up any system so that it is internally referenced first and then decided upon how to act, I think that's the baseline of ethics in data collection and sharing as far as privacy and security.
Any other comments on the privacy aspect of collecting random abstract data? I mean, we've talked about streetlights, we've talked about cars, we've talked about toasters. Behavioral patterns can be discerned from sensors in a variety of different places. And
I think the bottom line is don't be evil is hard. And actually, I like that approach of saying let's just avoid capturing information when we can. But the reality is there are a lot of databases out there, and more than likely Google knows more about you than the NSA. Hopefully when they say don't be evil, they mean it. But it's hard. There are a couple of interesting studies over the last year where people took obfuscated medical data and reconstructed not models of the individuals, but the individuals, figured out who they were. It just shows how hard that is to actually obfuscate data.
So
We run into similar things with missing persons, right, and refugees. If you're trying to reunite families, you have to collect certain data, and yet those people are probably missing or refugees because they're avoiding people or because bad things have happened. And it's often the data that we collect on them in order to reunite is not what they would use themselves to reunite. And so it's very much not about blanket technical solutions. It's about going in and listening to people about what they actually need.
Okay. So getting back to the hardware as opposed to the privacy, there are a lot of devices out there right now that are older and they're designed to work in the field for 15 or more years. And we're producing more secure devices today, and hopefully going forward they'll be even more secure. What do we do with those legacy devices that are already out in the field? Any options there?
So, for example, like hotel door locks that can be opened in less than 15 seconds if you happen to have an Arduino and a battery. So, I mean, that's a real case, of course, right?
And Mark can speak to that.
It's not theirs, actually. It's not theirs. Not theirs. He's okay. And I won't even name the company, but I mean, it'll take you 20 seconds of Googling to find the company. And by the way, the complete circuit description and software and everything you need to open every Marriott door. This is a Sheraton, right? Every Marriott door in the world, pretty much. The reality is there is a time lag in replacing those devices.
Because there's a
those
cost
aren't even internet-connected devices.
Right.
So I think we have to keep in mind that there will always be security breaks and that there will always be time lags in replacing the busted equipment.
Mark?
Yeah, I think the approach we look at is multi-layer. So assuming that some parts of the system are going to break, you have to have multiple. So in the door lock case, that's why they have a deadbolt inside your door as well. Right? So how do you prepare multiple layers and evolve those layers over time, knowing that as those pieces age, you can't replace them? Our readers on the wall are capital infrastructure. They only get replaced every 10 to 15 years, or when acquisitions happen or buildings get built or torn down. So the opportunity to replace those is low. So new solutions come out that go into greenfields, but down the wire from those door locks, we have to have additional factors of authentication that get used, whether they're behavioral, tying logical to physical. You can't go through the front door because you're also logged onto the VPN. Things that start to become a higher level of abstraction in looking at the security than just, is this card and reader working together?
Colin?
Replacing all devices, I was never in the situation that I have had to think about it, but it's probably very, very hard. It's not really my
Fine.
my field.
When you look at embedded security as a researcher, what are some of the soft targets that you go for? What are the points of entry that you start your investigation?
I know. A couple of years ago, I just scanned the internet more or less, but very specific parts. So all the IP space that was belonging to mobile network operators. Because a lot of embedded devices, especially the Internet of Things devices, are not connected over Wi-Fi or Ethernet, but over cellular networks, of course, because they sit somewhere with a battery, and so if they don't even have a power line, then they probably also don't have internet or cable or fixed internet. So I was looking at those devices, and this was an absolute catastrophe. Basic from unauthenticated administrator logins, to just the devices don't even have login, that you just connect to a port and they just spit out data. And so far I would say all of the devices I looked at that point in time were soft targets. You didn't have to do anything besides to connect to a port.
Colin, nearly all of those devices are IP masqueraded, right? So are you actually, no?
No.
No, sorry. Well, mine's a mobile phone is, by the way.
So most of the mobile phones are IP masqueraded,
yeah.
But then you're vehicle tracking apparently is not, or we found inventory management devices, so a Windows CE device with a handle and a barcode scanner, We found like hundreds of those.
I'm amazed. I mean, because with 1 billion mobile phones in the world, that would be more than a quarter of IP space.
Yes, no. So mobile phones, we've almost found no mobile phones.
Yeah.
But all the interesting stuff is not mobile phones.
Right. Okay.
We found like a few 100,000 like iOS devices and a few thousand where you still get like remote shells, but power automation systems, vehicle tracking. I don't know what we didn't find. I don't know. Name some industrial application, and we probably I didn't find any medical stuff at that point in time, but everything else. Yeah, like PLCs, smart meters, and
SCADA systems.
Yeah, traffic, like large-scale traffic control systems. We didn't get like that. That was actually authenticated, but they still were sitting on like a mobile phone IP or mobile cellular IP with a static IP address. So most of the other devices would like change over time, but we like scanned everything multiple times to determine if anything was like static. And yeah, you find basically everything. And
SCADA systems in Iran, perhaps? Just
no.
asking.
Yeah. Willow, did you?
When we're doing participatory mapping and using sensors, we don't really think about the security of things because we actively want more people to be engaged with them.
Mm-hmm.
So having a SIM card that's how the information is being broadcast and certain things in the device are being triggered. So if you have a camera that's watching a drain to see if it's clogged up or not because it's in a remote location, it's fine if more people trigger it. But those are for communally held assets.
So, I'm drawing a blank.
Ask them.
Yeah, I will in a moment. I guess, this has been broached earlier in the day, and I want to broach it again because it's important. Is this something that, as an industry, we will come to resolve, defining security for ourselves, or does it take something higher than that? Are we looking at government? I know there was discussion of having a consumer approval rating on security that was mentioned earlier, and there are associations that are being formed around hardware and mobile and so forth. So is that necessary here, or are we self-healing?
I was just in a 3-hour conversation on this morning.
Okay.
And I actually think it is going to take a higher authority, but it's not regulatory authorities. I think they'll be late to the party. I think the higher authority is insurance companies. You look at risk mitigation in general over the last, 1,000 years or so. Risk mitigation in various fields started when insurance companies started insuring that risk, and not until. So that's just starting today, cyber risk insurance. And the insurance companies actually want to be able to quantify risk. Today we can't quantify much of that risk. You have targets like, Target that have been incapable of quantifying risk, and insurance companies will force them to quantify the risk before they can cover it. So yes, there will be a higher authority, but hopefully it won't be government first.
Anyone?
I think he has a question.
All right. Josh, yes.
I agree that insurance wants to play a role and will play a role, especially when you have a kid run over by a self-driving car or something like that, or cyber Cuyahoga River moment. One challenge, though, that people are overlooking is insurance is kind of triggered and predicated on the idea of liability, and we have no software liability.
Actually, that's not necessarily true. So the law is not actually real clear on that. You all have signed agreements whenever you opened any piece of software saying that manufacturer has no liability, so that is true. But it's not even clear that click-through license, it's called. It's not even clear it's not clear in even all U.S. states whether that holds, and certainly around the world. So I really do think insurance is going to drive it because there are starting to be liability cases where the manufacturer is actually losing something. And when you get to hardware, the courts believe that they understand hardware better than software, and they certainly will assign liability.
So let's stay with questions out in the field. Are there any others? Yes, sir.
So I'm a little confused about the point you made about keep the hardware as simple as possible, because a lot of the infrastructure that's been deployed in IAC type environments the last few years is devoid of any, what I think most people consider minimum hardware requirements for a secure device, like secure identity, like, hardware random number generation, like, credential storage. So how do you all define that simple hardware? How do you define that in a secure environment? What is the minimum hardware you need?
I wish I could answer that. So since you're looking at me, I'll answer first. I wish I could answer that. I would simply say that you want to push the complexity as high up the network as possible. So if I'm dusting a field with sensors for O2, CO2, and pressure and those sorts of things, then I probably don't want to have identity in every single one of those devices, because the security is not necessarily an issue there. But I may want to secure identity for the device that's capturing information from that mesh of devices. On the other hand, there's situations where I want to know what the traffic is like. There are ways of finding out. And then, that was supposed to be funny, sorry. And the devices have identity built into the hardware, and I can take advantage of that device hardware and that identity hardware, and I will. So I wish I could give you a less wishy-washy answer. I'm just saying, let's make the devices as simple as possible, but no simpler.
I think from our point of view, it's the flexibility of the device. So moving away from things like ASICs that are going to have some of your security built into it, that when you discover that that version of AES is hacked and you're reliant on that, or some other algorithm that runs our T system, really what we want to be able to do is react. So when they talked earlier about 100% prevention versus 100% reaction, our goal is to be on the reaction side. So having things more in software with not necessarily less powerful hardware, but less dependency on what that hardware is.
Yeah, I would go with the same. So just remove very customized algorithms, or never make them in hardware. Just have more general purpose hardware, especially, and just run your whatever encryption algorithm in software. And of course, you want things like random number generators maybe in hardware, but you don't want your AES in hardware. As on a phone, for example, on a desktop PC on a phone, that's okay. You're going to replace this in 2 years, but yeah.
I don't have anything else to add.
Right.
We covered it.
I just want to follow up. So a random number generator, it seems like a lot of algorithms have been tripped up recently because they haven't been as diverse. And so hard coding it in a chip would be a problem. You mean providing space for that in the chip, in the
No, I
embedded?
think he was responding to the fact that you can't create a random number generator in software.
Right.
That's just a physical fact, so you might as well do it in hardware.
Okay, clarify. Yes?
Just thinking of what you said about insurance and quantifying risk. We have appliances that have to get underwriter lab tested, for example. Would there be something equivalent to a cyber UL where some of these devices should meet certain qualifications to decide how risky they are?
So I don't know if you realize that UL has actually looked at this themselves and ran away screaming. So I think that'll happen, but guess what pushed UL into creation? Insurance companies. So I point back to what I said before.
Why did UL run away screaming?
They didn't. Well, I can't speak for them. I just know that I talked to them. I talked to some folks at UL about it, and when I called back, they said we've decided this is just too hard for us.
I worked on this 15 years ago, and it still hasn't happened.
Right.
Any others? No? Any other questions?
Get some
Yes,
over there.
gentleman right there.
I can think of kind of two examples where hardware is actually getting a little bit more complicated and it's increasing security. And so I'm not sure if, how to reconcile that with the general notion that things should be simpler and then we should move more in software. The two that I want to bring up are, one, if we look at the EMV for payments, that's an example where, private keys are getting inserted into the actual card itself, the secure element. Terminals are getting much more secure. They're digitally signing transactions. And I think it's actually a good thing. a lot being done in hardware to create, the secure element inside the phone or secure enclave in the iOS devices. And I think that's another example where, maybe it's a different way of doing security, but, hardware is actually becoming a lot more complicated with benefits associated with security benefits.
But a mobile phone is like not an Internet of Things device. That's like consumer electronic. Turnaround time like 2 years maximum, maybe 3 or 4, and that's.
I hate to disagree with you, Colin. I think it is because there are people that are using sensor information from mobile phones to make decisions actually about societal impacts and so forth, and things like where the traffic is. So at least they're using the sensors in the mobile phone. It's just the mobile phone case is, as I was saying before, it's not really a case worth reviewing because you happen to have a supercomputer there anyway, so you might as well do a whole bunch of stuff with it. It's as simple as it can be and not simpler because you also want to do a whole bunch of things like run applications on it and run a graphical user interface that takes 90% of the processor. So you've got a supercomputer there, might as well use it. You can't make it simpler. The payments card is more interesting, actually, and I think it has to do with needing identity in the card more than anything else, and I did stipulate that identity is something you're going to need, as did Mark.
Well, I think in particular, in both those cases, you're talking about more the environment in which the software is running. They're not necessarily relying purely on that hardware for the security. So in the EMV case, you can run EMV in a variety of environments. The ideal place to run it is in tamper-proof or tamper-evident place like a SIM or a payment card is. But when they load that, they're loading that over the air. So that your SIM doesn't come necessarily capable of doing everything you want it to do from the start. So you're really using that as a secure computing environment. And then when you look at the solutions, there's a spectrum of those, going from a secure element to a trusted execution environment to running things in the code to running things in the cloud. And each solution has to be risk appropriate. Right? So when you have a financial transaction, it's likely you want to execute that in as secure as available to you at the time. And again, payment cards, things like that aren't designed to last for years and years. If you look at your credit card, there's an expiration date on it. So that card is only good 2-3 years, and you're going to get the next best of breed technology where it's still a cat and mouse game, right? Those cards have been hacked, they move on, and the game continues.
I believe there's a question there.
Yeah, something that kind of triggered something in my mind where a lot of the conversations I have around IoT is, well, that device isn't important, or that device doesn't have data we care about, or something like that. As a person that does penetration testing for a lot of years, I care way more about those devices than I care about the high value targets. Because ultimately, the code tends to see on networks that I want to break into and pivot from, or do lateral movement through your networks. How much of, for each of your perspectives, how much time is really thought about, even though this might be a sensor or a camera looking at like a drain, what does that actually mean in terms of if I don't have to authenticate to it, now I have a attack surface that I can then manipulate to hopefully, go from that endpoint to the rest of the network, for instance?
Nearly everything that it sends, so those we have set up so that they're only sending SMS messages. They're not sending a data stream. And so I hope that reduces the attack surface sufficiently.
I think from our perspective, the devices we're creating are designed to be used in a security environment. So we're thinking about that from the beginning. I think it's a different problem when you're trying to design a toaster and you're suddenly become vulnerable to things you'd never planned on.
Well, the point is that it isn't different, right, when you're designing a toaster. So,
Right.
I think that goes back to the point that you were making, and that is...
And then from the toaster manufacturer, their perspective coming at it is how do I make a good toaster? And we're building, we ultimately share the same problem, but we're already thinking about it because what we're deploying is intended to be secure.
Yeah, well, I think the point is that everything ought to be intended to be secure. That
Right.
was the point that was being made, and I absolutely agree. And and security training is not required training for any software developers anywhere that I know of, and it ought to be. But I am the cavalry. Absolutely, it's got to be everybody. I don't know how much software is in a toaster, but I do know there's about 100 million lines of code in my Ford Fusion hybrid, and I am absolutely sure that it's totally secure.
That makes one of you.
No, there was the deal or two.
80 processors, 100 million lines, 3 networks.
Colin? No.
I know. I would say, of course, like any device should be like have, I don't know, so security put in them while you're designing them, no matter if it's like a camera or a toaster, if it has like IP connectivity. Somebody's going to do something with it. If there's no data to steal, then you just like use that to like connect to another device to steal data. So that's like one area where we like looked into like build more in like basic security and really in systems that like run on cheap hardware. So that's exactly what we're looking for, to just bring basic mitigation techniques you would find like on modern desktop systems, to like put them into like really low cost hardware.
And I'd love to just add that if I'm wrong about this, I would love to know, and I'd love to know sooner rather than later. Okay, we'll talk more later.
I think the other approach we're looking at in terms of building security enablement technologies is trying to remove the friction from that. So generally there's a balance between convenience and security. And so if you think about things that are super secure, there's usually a lot of rigmarole you have to go through, entering PINs, entering long passwords. You know, think of the IT policies you have to go through. And what one of our goals is to make the security and the use of that security easier, so that it doesn't become a decision on whether you want to go through the effort to include it or not. So how do you make that a default place in the mechanism by not interfering with that user experience?
So we just have a few more minutes left in our panel, but I want to leave you guys with an opportunity to respond. A lot of discussion around, we had desktops for 20 years, and we've learned a lot about security in that time. We had the internet, and it wasn't designed for security, and we made it do credit card processing and all these things that it wasn't built for, and so we retrofit it and everything. It seems like we have a new opportunity here with IoT. Are we going to screw it up, or are we going to get it right? So I'll ask each of you to respond to that. And hopefully we'll end on a optimistic note. So.
We'll always fail at things, but I hope we fail at this one for more interesting reasons than we have in the past.
Yeah, that's, I couldn't say anything better than that. Yeah, I think there will be like some really big fails, I guess, that we have seen before, and like hopefully like new more interesting fails, as Willow said. Yeah.
Mark? So I agree that there will be more interesting fails, at least from a researcher's perspective. What I think is that we'll probably have less naivete, that something bad won't happen. But I think our ability to predict, in the fighter pilot situation, we're still going to be attacked, bad things are still going to happen, but I think we'll at least be aware going in that it's a possibility.
That's well said. I mean, we're going to screw it up. But hopefully, not only will we screw it up in new and more interesting ways, but in smaller ways, so that when we fix it, we won't be as screwed up in the larger scale. But yeah, we're going to screw it up, absolutely. You'd learn a lot more from failure than success.
True.
There's a wonderful book called To Engineer is Human. It's by Henry Petrosky, and he's talking about bridges, and he points out you don't learn anything from a bridge that doesn't fall down. Because all it tells you is, that design seems to be working. Once it falls down, you know that design in that place doesn't work. And you've learned something. So we're going to learn a few things.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think one thing what you should like think about when you like design an embedded system or an IoT system, think about or have the thing in your head that at some point there will be a problem, and something will fail with that device, and you just like keep that in mind and like have like ways to build in a way to like recover, because it will burn. And
yeah, I think it's the known unknown versus an unknown unknown.
Oh, thank you, Donald.
All right. On that note, I want to thank my panelists, and I especially want to call out Paul for organizing this. I have done what you have done, but with multiple people surrounding me and supporting me, and I know you did a lot of this on your own. So thank you very much, Paul.